We might as well start with the granddaddy of them all, the absolute epitome of the scammy, cash-grabby licensed tie-in game. I'm talking about 1982's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which was such a cynical and obvious cash-in that it's credited as one of the main contributors to the infamous video game crash of 1983. The game was developed almost entirely by solo developer Howard Scott Warshaw over the course of just 5 weeks, pressured by Atari to launch before the holiday season and capitalize on the massive success of the movie that same year. To say the gameplay is basic would be an understatement. You move around a little 6-screen world, eating Reese's Pieces and deliberately falling into the many pits dotting the landscape, I guess? Though that feels like too weighty a word for what we're looking at. You're looking for scattered pieces of a phone that you can use to phone home. It's honestly like a game that was designed by someone who watched one trailer for the movie and that's all they had to go on. Unfortunately, the corporate suits didn't learn their lesson after the industry-wide crash that ensued, because this is only the first on our list of the 100 worst tie-in games of all time. Let me go over some rules of engagement before we move on. First off, we're not including any mobile games, since they are by their very nature rapacious and manipulative attempts to cash in on a given franchise, and most of them can hardly even be called games at all. So real console and PC titles only. We're gonna go through 4 broad categories: games based on movies, toys, comic book heroes, and TV shows. And we've picked out the absolute worst of the worst. These are games that barely have any effort behind them and exist for one reason only: to take advantage of popular IPs, using them as a sort of Trojan horse to extract money from fans and unsuspecting but well-meaning grandmothers. And fair warning, you will have fond memories of some of these games, but don't let the rose-tinted lenses of your nostalgia goggles cloud your vision. These games are nothing but slop, wearing the husk of beloved franchises to disguise their mediocrity and uninspired laziness. Let's begin with the most popular and often the most lucrative category, the movie tie-in. People of the world, spice up your life. That was the promise of Sony's Spice World for the PlayStation, which has you take on the role of a wannabe Spice Girl, remixing tunes and choreographing dances. What does this mean exactly? Basically, pick a song and mash 9 audio samples into a choppy 18-second remix. It's always awkward and mismatched and sounds about as bad as you'd expect. Then a cheesy disco dude teaches you some basic dance moves which you perform on repeat over and over. The whole thing is pretty ho-hum, and though I must admit a certain penchant for a certain pigtailed member of the group, even she can't save this game from its complete lack of depth, making this just another prime example of a popular brand slapped on top of an inferior game. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, I've played Ghostbusters 2 for the NES, developed by the famous HAL Laboratory, and it's not that bad. Actually, you're probably not thinking that, since that version only released in Europe and Japan, and YouTube tells me that I get very little play overseas. But just go with me on this. Anyway, let me enlighten you, because there were actually 2 distinct Ghostbusters 2 games that tied into the hit 1989 film. One made by HAL, and the other developed by a third-party studio named Imagineering, published by Activision. And it's this version that I'm sorry to report went down in history as a lazy cash grab. What drags it down is its mind-numbing repetition. Across the 5 bland levels, the lackluster gameplay loop will have you bored after just 20 minutes. Not that you have to wait that much longer for the game to end given its short 2-hour or so average length. But it'll be a long 2 hours, believe me. Enemies barely vary from each other, even bosses just demand longer holds on the stream of your proton pack, with no real strategy. Your guy moves around at a very unsatisfying pace and he's barely able to clear low hurdles. And shooting lags just enough to let ghosts clip you mid-fire, forcing constant deaths with complete restarts because, of course, there was no saving on the NES. They could have at least implemented a password system. Or a pause button, and you heard that right, in Ghostbusters 2 you shockingly couldn't even pause your torment. Skull Island: Rise of Kong is a third-person action-adventure game where you play as a young gorilla named Kong on a quest to avenge his parents' death against the beast Gaw. Gameplay is pretty much what you'd expect, platforming across jungles, swamps, and caves while battling dinosaur-like enemies with punches, roars, and a rage mode for big combos. But the controls are so clunky that it makes every movement, even a simple jump, feel like you're gambling with your life. Combat is uninteresting and poorly designed, and you're battling constant bugs and crashes as often as you're battling the real enemies. Graphics look outdated, levels are bland mazes, and cutscenes are hilariously bad, turning what should have been an epic tale of giant ape revenge into a boring slog. Battleship, a game based on a movie based on a simplistic board game, is a rushed tie-in FPS developed by Double Helix Games. You play as a soldier blasting alien invaders on bland Hawaiian islands with generic-feeling guns, and there's also a mode where you of course command battleships in surprisingly brief, grid-based naval strategy segments. It misses the mark pretty hard due to the awful gameplay mechanics, especially the way weapons have a huge bullet spread that forces you into close-range fights where you quickly run out of ammo, with frustratingly slow reloads and weapon swaps often resulting in your death, and it feels unfair when that happens. Controls rip off Call of Duty but feel way worse, enemies flank you unfairly, and the linear level design traps you with invisible walls while you search for collectibles that exist for very little reason other than to make it feel like more of a game. The strategy bits that should have been the main draw of a game called Battleship are the most disappointing of all, feeling underdeveloped and lackluster. The first, but believe me when I say far from the last game made by LJN on this list, has had even creator Bob Gale admitting was, and I quote, one of the worst games ever. This was 1989's Back to the Future. The clunky controls make the simple platforming super frustrating. This is one of those games that's difficult in all the wrong ways, like how you're constantly going to end up falling to your death because the jumping is so unresponsive, and the timing that's needed feels impossible without repetitive trial and error. The graphics are ugly and bland, and the music is grating and unfaithful to the movie. The one thing Back to the Future has going for it is its mercifully short length, clocking in at less than an hour, not counting the constant annoying restarts you'll have to deal with. This one is hardly worth picking up at all. Wayne's World is a platformer that puts you in control of the famous duo Wayne and no, scratch that. In the Super Nintendo and Genesis version, you can only play as Wayne. Bummer, dude. Anyway, your goal is to rescue Garth from an absurd gelatinous cube. The 6 short, repetitive levels are stitched together from generic assets like bland forests and factories and feature boss fights against knockoff villains. Jumping feels floaty and imprecise, often sending you plummeting into spikes with zero warning, while hit detection is sloppy, leading to foes clipping right through your attacks. This slog of a game developed by Canadian developer Grey Matter turned what should have been a party time excellent tie-in into a tedious nightmare. Fight Club is a 3D arena fighter where you select characters from the movie or one of the original fighters divided into brawlers, grapplers, or martial artists. Controls are slippery and shallow, with button mashing often yielding far better results than aiming for precision. Never a good thing for a fighting game. And the animations are extremely stiff. The story mode features voice acting that completely mangles iconic lines from the movie, especially the rants from Tyler Durden, which feel flat and just forced. And the AI is prone to spamming cheap grabs or just straight up freezing entirely. Far from the brutal rush promised by publisher Vivendi, Fight Club instead delivers a subpar, bog-standard fighting game and even fails at that. In Godzilla, you control the iconic titular kaiju as you rampage through linear Tokyo-based missions, smashing skyscrapers to build a heat gauge for atomic breath blasts while fending off military jets and rival monsters like Mothra. If that sounds like a concept you can't possibly screw up, I can't help but agree with you, but Natsumi Atari apparently managed it nonetheless. The combat completely lacks any amount of depth, mainly relying on repetitive button mashing, and the monsters lazily reuse movesets but still end up completely unbalanced somehow. Missions drag on with the same destroy and defend cycle amid city blocks that look like PS2 leftovers, even on the PlayStation 4 version. Despite all this, the game does have something of a cult following that lasts to this day, with some longtime franchise fans considering it so bad it's good, especially following its delisting from the PlayStation Store in 2017. Antz Extreme Racing is a budget kart racer where players control ant characters from the 2002 movie, which is, I maintain to this day, assuredly not a ripoff of A Bug's Life, having come out a full month earlier. Although, to be fair, Steve Jobs always claimed that A Bug's Life was already well into production, and that the idea was stolen by DreamWorks. Anyway, we can ignore that question for now because the video game tie-in for A Bug's Life just barely avoids a feature on this list, saved by the PlayStation version, which just bordered on mediocre. But Antz most definitely earns a spot, with slippery physics that turn every corner into an uncontrollable skid, graphics that are blocky and low detail, repetitive tracks that completely lack variety, and a short campaign with zero replayability. Antz is one of the worst kart racers to have ever been released. Some props have to go to developer Supersonic, I suppose, for thinking outside the box and doing something other than a lazy platformer, but to say the execution here lacks polish would be an understatement. A lot of people point to Home Alone on lists of bad movie tie-in games, but the game was practically Super Metroid by comparison to this one. In Home Alone 2, you once again control Kevin McAllister as you navigate New York-inspired platforming levels like Central Park and the subway, the goal being to reach each stage's end while grabbing items you can use later for traps. But like with so many other games on this list, bad controls turn every leap into an unfairly punishing challenge. And ladders, oh boy, these prove too great a hurdle for young Kevin, who will slide off mid-climb, dropping you straight into a swarm of enemies. Once you get back to Uncle Rob's house, gameplay shifts to a tedious chase. You place household gadgets like iron and paint cans in rooms to damage the burglars Harry and Marv, who lumber after you slowly. One of the many cash grabs on this list, rushed out by developer THQ, Home Alone 2 takes the clever setup of Home Alone and removes any ounce of fun from the equation. The Mummy: Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is the third-person action-adventure game tie-in to the third Brendan Fraser Mummy movie, with gameplay involving basic platforming like jumping rickety ledges that often blend into the background fog or shadows, forcing you into leaps of faith that often wind up with you plummeting to your death. And the fixed camera angle makes platforming even more frustrating, not to mention leaving you blindsided by attacks from behind. Combat involves basically just running around punching your foes, with guns tacked on almost as an afterthought, proving little help when enemies swarm you in unbalanced hordes that make you circle strafe around just to survive. Coming in at only around 5 hours, the game's way too short. Not that you want to play it for much longer than that, considering the dull voice lines and overall lack of charm of the game. With plenty of banter about family, and over-the-top gadgets like in the movie franchise, Fast and Furious Crossroads has you in the role of a new recruit in Dom Toretto's crew, pulling off heists and chases across Morocco, Spain, and the US. Missions kick off with cutscenes featuring impressively the real cast from the movies, including Vin Diesel. This is maybe the one positive about the game, because following the cutscenes you're dropped into boring scripted sequences and inane fetch quests designed as high-stakes ops. Another game that clocks in at only around 5 hours, it's obvious Slightly Mad Studios either wasn't given adequate time or didn't really care whether the game they made was worth the money. And it's not as if they weren't capable of making a good game either, with previous titles like Need for Speed Shift and Project Cars. The studio was shut down by parent EA 2 years later. Based on the criminally underrated flop movie Highlander, this game is a bare-bones sword-fighting game where you play as Connor McLeod across fights with 3 immortal foes. Each fight loads a new static background, a dojo, a rainy alley, or a castle, and the action basically just boils down to using the joystick to advance, duck, and swing your katana while watching energy bars drain. After finally defeating your foe, you'll hear a weird computerized blip signal with an off-screen decapitation and accompanying splatter sound, making way to the next pretty much identical fight. Controls feel horribly unresponsive, like swinging through molasses, and your real 3 foes throughout the fight aren't your immortal enemies, but the game's input lag, stuttering, and just sheer boredom. Taking just 10 disappointing minutes to beat once you know what you're doing, Highlander was a good, or bad, depending on how you look at it, example of British dev Canvas's standard MO in its short lifespan, working with notable tie-in publisher Ocean. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1 casts you as Harry in a third-person shooter with stealth mechanics that ditches the series' open-world charm for linear, corridor-style levels, packed with shootouts with Death Eaters. You blast out spells like Stupefy, which essentially equate to just magic bullets, from behind cover while Harry shouts "Stupefy, Stupefy" over and over ad nauseum. It gets old pretty quick, with nothing to do but move forward spamming the trigger, the lack of polish shining through in frustrating moments where you get stuck on invisible walls or your weapon wheel lags out mid-fight. The worst of it is the camera, which twists around wildly during chases, clipping through scenery and obscuring enemies just as they spot you. It was a real disappointment for fans of Harry Potter that a big studio like EA would push out such an obviously subpar product, which should have made it no surprise when Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 came out the following year and was every bit as bad as the first part. Dropping the stealth focus of its predecessor, you can instead spend the entire game focused on the boring cover and shoot mechanics. The AI is dumb, allies barely help, and controls feel stiff, like the game was slapped together in months to hit the film's release. Which is probably because it was. The only lesson EA seeming to have learned being that you can get away with a lot and still make a decent amount of money if your tie-in IP is strong enough. The 4 or 5 hour length make it feel just kind of like a long movie, but in the worst way possible, because you hardly need to focus at all as you zone out and trudge through the grey corridors, nothing to break up the tedium since even the side missions from part 1 were dropped from the game, presumably just one more low effort way to squeeze out just a little bit more profit. Street Fighter. The game, the movie, the game, released in 1995 for next-gen consoles, and fans of both the games and the franchise in general were super hyped, making the game the commercial success everyone knew it would be. You pick from 12 digitized versions of actors from the movie like Jean-Claude Van Damme's Guile or Ming-Na Wen's Chun-Li, then battle in movie-inspired arenas like Shadowlu's Temple. First coming out for arcades, the console versions were merely a port, and a bad port at that. Controls lag constantly, making it really hard to hit precise combos, resulting in most of the time just button mashing and cheap hits ending up being the winning strategy. And the usually fluid combat animations from previous Street Fighter II games here grind to a halt with brutal FPS drops, resulting in poor gameplay but also turning the sprites into a blur hardly recognizable as the movie cast, which was the main selling point of the game in the first place. 2003's RoboCop was a weird cash-in attempt for a series that hadn't released a movie for a full 10 years, the most recent entries in the franchise being merely a couple of failed TV shows. Nevertheless, French publisher and developer Titus Interactive, more from them later, figured there was money to be had and acquired the rights to make games based on the RoboCop movies in 1999. The result is 2003's RoboCop, where you mope along through 9 sluggish missions, every shootout seeming to take forever due to controls that make aiming feel like wrestling a tank, hardly helped at all by a broken auto-target which locks onto nothing useful. Worse, you can't duck or strafe effectively, leaving you a sitting duck as waves of 20+ Neo-Detroit goons swarm you from every vent and doorway. The only thing saving you from being peppered by a million bullets all at the same time being their garbage AI, which has a tendency to send them spinning in circles or clipping through walls. Titus obviously rushed this game without a lot of thought going to playability, which is actually a real shame because up until this point the RoboCop video games had been pretty universally praised for their quality. 007 Legends was created to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the Bond franchise, and includes missions from every single actor's Bond film era, culminating with the recently released, at that time anyway, Skyfall, starring Daniel Craig, who's featured prominently on the cover art. Gameplay mainly revolves around shooting waves of enemies in cramped hallways, respawning endlessly until you hit checkpoints. The stealth sections demand pixel-perfect hiding but glitch out if you bump a wall, leaving you vulnerable while you fight with the crummy mechanics. Boss fights drag on as boring QuickTime events, mashing buttons to punch enemies in what plays like a lazy Wii boxing minigame, breaking any tension with awkward prompts that often fail mid-combo. This soulless cash-in on the storied Bond legacy was obviously rushed to release at the same time as Skyfall, unfortunate given how great the concept of having all these Bonds together could have ended up. Based on the box office bomb Uwe Boll movie, which raked in a grand total of $35,000 in theaters, Tunnel Rats 1968 is a first-person shooter where you play as a US soldier in Vietnam, dropped into enemy territory to clear out Viet Cong tunnels. The game has a short, linear campaign where you hack through dense jungle with an M16 or knife, then squeeze into claustrophobic, pitch-black underground mazes packed with booby traps like tripwires. Spotting these requires shining your flashlight just right and clicking precisely to disarm them. Miss by just a little bit and you die instantly, often forcing a full level restart since manual saves don't exist. This core loop turns frustrating fast. The tunnels dominate half the game, offering zero room to dodge or flank, so combat boils down to blindly spraying bullets at grunting enemies who stumble right into your line of fire thanks to their brain-dead AI. But unlike most other games on this list, I'm not entirely convinced that laziness or greed were primarily at play with Tunnel Rats. I think in this case we had a relatively new developer, Replay Studios, that was in way over their heads despite giving it their best shot. Replay was shut down only months after the game's release. According to Uwe Boll himself, who did a pretty interesting short interview with gaming journalist Gareth von Kallenbach, there's a name, just before the game's release, it was supposed to come out for both the PC and the Xbox 360 originally, though mysteriously the console version never materialized. The Hunt for Red October is based on the Sean Connery film of the same name, with the Super Nintendo version being only one of 11 games that use the infamous Super Scope accessory, though in this case it's only used for the special bonus levels which put you in first-person view, and even then it's actually optional technically. But without the Super Scope, the controls of this mode are really poor, which makes the whole thing just seem like a lazy attempt to cash in on the Super Scope in addition to the movie IP. So multiple layers of cash grabby fun with this one. What makes Red October so annoying to play is the suffocating difficulty, born from lazy design choices like enemies spawning right on screen edges, already firing, overwhelming your tiny sub in swarms that demand precise dodges. The inertia-heavy controls exacerbate this problem with your vessel lumbering along based on momentum. Interestingly, there was a different Hunt for Red October game that came out a few years earlier for the PC, this one based on the original Tom Clancy novel. And while reception was more mixed than this time, this game was also criticized for its confusing difficulty level. Star Wars has a long history of video games, and most of them are pretty great actually for both franchise fans and gamers alike. But even Star Wars is not immune to a lazy cash grab every now and then. Two of the worst ever Star Wars games came out in the same year, 1997. The first was Yoda Stories, a top-down adventure where you play a young Jedi training under Yoda on Dagobah. Each of the 15 short levels drops you onto a randomly generated planet like Tatooine or Hoth to fetch items, chat with Star Wars cameos, and fight off stormtroopers or beasts. You swing a lightsaber in awkward, blocky combat that feels like stabbing at shadows. Gameplay is very repetitive, with each planet following the same fetch quest loop where you scour a bland map for batteries or keys, backtrack across empty screens because nothing connects logically, and then warp back to Yoda for a pat on the head. There's no real story driving you forward, it's just rote tasks dressed in a pixelated Star Wars skin. The other junky 1997 Star Wars game is Masters of Terras-Kazi, a 3D fighting game where you pick from 10 Star Wars characters and battle in arenas inspired by iconic, if a little played out, spots like Dagobah Swamps or the icy plains of Hoth. Matches either end by knockout, shoving foes off ledges, or outlasting the timer with the most health. The stiff, jerky animations in this game result in your character lurching forward haltingly, joints locking unnaturally despite LucasArts promising excellent motion capture realism, and this definitely kills the pace of fights. Even if the animations were perfectly smooth though, the complete lack of balance in movesets mean you quickly ditch any strategy for instead just spamming overpowered force blasts or unblockable grabs in a cheese fest like many badly designed fighting games wind up being. I don't blame them for trying. Everyone was seeking to cash in on the fighting craze of the mid to late 90s, but this one misses the mark entirely. Weirdly coming out a couple years after the movie it's based on, but timed to release alongside the first movie's sequel, is 2019's Jumanji the video game. In the game, you're supposed to hunt down 4 scattered Jumanji pieces by mowing through waves of identical enemies using basic melee shooting and dodge mechanics. Then you huddle at an obelisk and defend it from respawning foes while it charges, a segment that drags on seemingly forever as your dumb AI teammates wander off or get stuck. Once the obelisk is charged, you carry out the pieces and shout Jumanji to warp out. And that's pretty much it for Jumanji the video game. There are no story cutscenes, no bosses, just this exact sequence repeated across levels with only minor texture swaps, sort of giving you the impression that you're actually doing something different. The campaign is ridiculously short, at around an hour, leaving cosmetic unlocks as the only progression, which just ain't enough to motivate anyone to keep playing. In 2006, Atomic Planet Entertainment, along with publisher Blast Entertainment, made a baffling decision to make a video game based on the somewhat successful Beverly Hills Cop franchise of the 90s. Releasing only in Europe, this game puts you in control of Axel Foley, or what's supposed to be Axel Foley, but instead of resembling Eddie Murphy, you're playing as a blocky, unrecognizable blob with a frozen grimace. Anyway, you're playing as Axel Foley as you engage in gunfights, chases, and light puzzles across several Beverly Hills-based levels. You blast generic thugs with pistols and shotguns that feel limp and unresponsive, like firing wet noodles, while your aiming drifts wildly and enemies soak up bullets without flinching. There are some driving sections as well, though in these you're sliding all over the place, careening into walls like a competitor on Supermarket Sweep. It's no wonder some consider this obscure entry a contender for the worst ever PlayStation 2 game. Charlie's Angels, based on the 2000 movie, involves playing as the Three Angels, switching between them to use their similar fighting styles against thugs stealing global monuments. Levels mainly span spots that are supposed to resemble sunny marinas and foggy docks, blending simple platforming, ladder climbs, and switch puzzles with combat against waves of palette-swapped enemies. You mash, punch, kick, block, and jump to clear rooms, grabbing pipes and chairs as improvised weapons, which at least breaks up the monotony a little bit, but it quickly devolves into tedium once more, as moves feel unresponsive and hit detection is frustratingly loose, making your attacks whiff way more often than they should, even on slow enemies. And the enemies just keep spawning, the same guys over and over. The camera jerks around unpredictably, locking behind you or spinning to blank walls so grenades and bricks fly in from off screen and damage you before you can even react. Eventually, you'll follow the monotonous arrows to the end of the short 2 or 3 hour game and wonder why you bothered picking it up at all, when you could have just watched the movie itself in about the same amount of time, and with a lot better, plot. Dragon Ball Evolution on the PlayStation Portable is a 3D arena fighter that follows the movie's plot in a short story mode, where you control Goku and a handful of film characters like Bulma and Piccolo through linear battles against different bosses. It's not always that the Rotten Tomatoes viewer and critic scores line up, but for the movie Dragon Ball Evolution, both scores sit well below 20%, a rare and unfortunate accomplishment. So to be fair, with a movie that bad, you've got an uphill battle when designing a video game. Even so, the game design is lazy and uninspired. Iconic action from other Dragon Ball video game titles like soaring through mountains or clashing with epic ki blast is completely absent here. Instead, fights just feel flat and low stakes, as if the developers at the studio, Dimps, just swapped character models from a generic fighting game to hit the movie's release deadline without caring. Visuals are drab, the AI is bad, and multiplayer is a half-baked letdown, making the game ultimately no better than the movie. We return to the Ghostbusters franchise for our next game because this one, which was panned by critics as one of the worst games of 2016, has such soul-crushing repetition that every mission feels almost exactly the same. They all recycle the same beat: mow down identical slime blobs and skull heads in tight packs, pause to vent your weapon, scan a foggy room, trap a mini-boss, and get ready to do it all over again. There are no fresh mechanics or escalating threats that emerge across the 10 short stages, just more of the same laborsome slog. Making matters worse, if you're playing by yourself, your AI teammates are absolutely useless. The game lacks any sort of challenge, and yet its 6-hour story nevertheless feels hard to finish because of the frustratingly slow and boring combat. And the voice acting is horrible and drones on as you go. Though to be fair, given how bad the acting was in the movie itself, even a perfect facsimile would have been difficult to listen to at length. Alvin and the Chipmunks is a rhythm game that puts you in control of the Chipmunk Trio as they tour from dingy school dances to packed rock festivals, belting out 40 pop covers from bands like Blink-182 by tapping buttons to match falling notes in rhythm sections akin to Guitar Hero. Or that's how they marketed it anyway. But unlike Guitar Hero, the note timing here is laggy, with brutally unforgiving notes that you swear you hit, but due to bad calibration you end up not credited for them. And this is a problem even on easy mode. The first ever game by short-lived American publisher Brash Entertainment, Alvin and the Chipmunks' unresponsive controls, which are really table stakes for a rhythm game, make this one just one more bad tie-in trying to cash in on the momentary popularity of a genre. Based on the campy but endearing movie of the same name, Last Action Hero is a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you control action hero Jack Slater, slugging through movie parody levels like dingy alleys and exploding warehouses. The problem here is that while the scenes might work as a cliche of action movie tropes, in a 1993 beat-em-up this is pretty much what the backgrounds just looked like, and that makes the game feel generic and pointless. The uninspired design could maybe be forgiven if the gameplay was any good, but that was equally boring, with the most simplistic implementation of punch, kick, shoot, beat-em-up action that you've ever seen. Collision detection is god-awful, especially on the NES version. Levels are repetitive, the graphics are poor, and Schwarzenegger's charm is nowhere to be found in the game. Jumper, Griffin's Story is a short 3-hour third-person action game where you play as Griffin, a teen unlocking teleportation powers to evade hunters from the Paladin Secret Society. The unique mechanic of the game is your character's ability to jump forward, like in the movie, essentially a cheap-looking teleport functionality that's as imprecise and twitchy as you might imagine. So the core mechanic of the game is its biggest downfall, often making you overshoot targets or clip into scenery. Like so many of this era, the camera didn't do the game any favors either, with auto-swiveling erratically flipping angles during fights, which made the teleport accuracy even worse. Apart from this bad jump mechanic, the gameplay in melee combat was a repetitive button-mashing snore. This is another one from publisher Brash Entertainment, who made quite the name for themselves in the 1 year they existed, putting out several of these trash tie-ins developed by no-name studios on a tiny budget. Rambo, the video game, is an on-rails shooter that retells the stories from the first 3 Rambo games, with you controlling John Rambo in linear levels, blending shooting, basic stealth, and melee takedowns. You auto-advance through jungles and villages, cursor aiming at enemies while building a wrath meter for these bursts that come out in slow motion. You unlock perks via points you get from kills, and challenges encourage replays, but why would you? Well, that's all Rambo has going for it, because the whole campaign clocks in at just 3 to 4 hours, a travesty for a game in 2014. As you can see, the graphics are muddy and outdated, and the gameplay is constantly interrupted by these QuickTime events that are shoehorned in everywhere, halting momentum for button mash prompts that demand perfect timing or instant death, often without warning. These interactions dominate the stealth bits, rendering them barely playable and exposing the lazy design by Polish developer Teon, who specialized throughout their history in garbage tie-ins and shovelware, but has actually managed to up their game somewhat in recent years with releases like RoboCop Rogue City and Terminator Resistance, which came out in 2019. So a bit of a good news turnaround story there, which is nice to see. But alas, not all Terminator games have been good. Some were absolute hot garbage, like 2003's Rise of the Machines. In this FPS, where you play as Arnold's T-850 from the movie, aiming is unwieldy and overshoots wildly on the default sensitivity, giving you an awful first impression until you mess with the settings and get it a little better. Reloading halts your shots mid-burst when you run out of bullets, and weapon swaps demand awkward button confirms that have a tendency to glitch out, leaving you defenseless. And the janky combat isn't even the worst part. The game is riddled with bugs from top to bottom, with some of the worst being your HUD vanishing after you die, objective markers pointing backward through the empty levels, and enemies clipping through walls. Melee brawls devolve into stiff, unresponsive wrestling that feels like mashing buttons against an unresponsive dummy, especially in the infamous SWAT level, where you're expected to non-lethally whack officers without killing them, an exercise in pure frustration. The game is short, and by the end, you'll be so sick of Arnold Schwarzenegger's one-liners that you'll never want to hear his voice again. Initially planned for release alongside the film in 1996, the video game tie-in for The Crow actually came out the following year after a delay. You might think this is a positive sign that rather than rush out the game to meet a deadline like so many others, they delay it to ensure a higher quality. But you'd be wrong, because when it did come out, it was such an unpolished mess, it really makes you wonder what they did with all that extra time. The tank-style controls make everything feel slow and clunky, with delayed turns that spin you in awkward circles while enemies swarm you from behind. Lining up attacks feels impossible, especially when hit detection fails and rocket-toting bad guys blast you unfairly before you can even react. And fights repeat endlessly with the same basic combos against nearly identical crowds. A lot of people have pointed out over the years how similar the game is to developer Grey Matter's original game Perfect Weapon from the year before, making it painfully obvious just how much was recycled and reused for The Crow. This was a mistake, obviously, considering that even that game was just a shoddy knockoff of a Resident Evil style game, and it was badly received as well. Par for the course for Grey Matter, unfortunately, for whom this would be the last ever release. A tie-in to the reboot movie from the same year and featuring all the same cast except Johnny Depp, who I guess was too expensive, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is a 3D adventure game with hideous graphics, only outdone by its hideous sound and music. Most of the game revolves around puzzles, like commanding Oompa Loompas to harvest gumdrops, shear cotton candy sheep, or roll massive physics-defying balls into pipes to unjam machines. This mechanic could have made for an interesting Pikmin-style game had it been executed well, but instead the little AI-controlled helpers are annoyingly glitchy and ignore your commands, preferring instead to bump into walls and bumble about aimlessly. There's also little variety, with the game having you repeat the same tasks over and over, and with no real hints what you're supposed to do either. You'll block the same vents 4 times in a row, wrestling the ball's unpredictable bounces for 20 minutes each try, only to realize the objective was vaguely implied by a flickering light that nobody ever notices. G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra is based on the first of the 3 films in the G.I. Joe series. The first movie was a moderate box office success despite being panned by critics and getting only a lukewarm reception from audiences. But of course, being G.I. Joe, the real money was always going to be in the merchandising. And the video game was one area Hasbro and publisher EA were hoping to make some easy profits. The problems are similar to those of other shoddy third-person shooters of the era, with a bad camera, unresponsive cover mechanics, and repetitive bland enemy design. This is exacerbated by the fact that health regenerates unevenly, so often a stray hit sends you way back to a checkpoint that feels like ages ago, amplifying the boredom by forcing you to retry the exact same enemy gauntlet and giving the game a false sense of challenge. Rushed development by Double Helix to hit the movie's release meant the game lacked all polish. Graphics look dated, animations stutter, and character swaps feel pointless because abilities barely change the monotonous gunplay. When Aliens Colonial Marines came out in 2013, the game was so bad it led to a lawsuit being filed by players for false advertising. Among the complaints listed in the lawsuit were the atrocious graphics, which didn't even come close to those shown in demos at trade shows prior to launch, which were described as actual gameplay by Gearbox's CEO Randy Pitchford. The demos also lied about features of the game itself, such as level design and AI. Pitchford countered that he had no control over how the game was marketed by the publisher Sega, and in fact, he had personally lost between $10 and $15 million of his own money trying to make up for underfunding by Sega. You do have to feel a little bad for him, because I'm inclined to believe Gearbox really did try to make a good game considering the circumstances. But instead, this ended up yet another blow to their reputation, following just a couple years after Duke Nukem Forever flopped. With AI allies that charge blindly into ambushes or friendly fire, and enemies that glitch through walls or loop endlessly without attacking, their pathfinding's so broken they bump into ceilings like drunken moths. The game is robbed of any real dread, making for a pretty dull experience. 5 years before Colonial Marines was another disaster in the Alien universe, Alien vs. Predator Requiem. This is a third-person action game where you control a lone predator hunting aliens in the dark after an outbreak on Earth resulting from a crashed ship. You traverse through the linear levels, which are just mostly bland, jagged streets and empty buildings, using the analog nub to move while tapping shoulder buttons non-stop to swing the camera, since the PSP lacks a second stick for smooth aiming. You can get upgrades from honor points, which you earn by sparing humans and tagging kills, unlocking dual cannons for better cloaking, but these changes feel pointless amid the repetitive gameplay. Every mission boils down to the same fetch-kill loop, where you hunt glowing objectives, dissolve alien nests, and repeat for hours without much variety or tension, like a dumbed-down hack-and-slash rushed out just to tie into the movie. Fair enough, because that's exactly what it is. Releasing 2 years after the movie following considerable development delays, Blues Brothers 2000 is a 3D platformer where you play as Elwood Blues, punching ghosts, zombies, and cops through 4 short levels to collect 100 musical notes per stage and rescue your bandmates. Combat feels stiff, with awkward carpal tunnel-inducing combos like mashing R and B to kick enemies. But the real frustration hits during jumps, with unresponsive inputs often failing mid-leap, sending Elwood plummeting off ledges into instant death, especially on narrow platforms. And the boring puzzles, like stacking crates to reach high ledges, demand precise timing that's also ruined by the sloppy controls. Blues Brothers 2000 was published by Titus, who is making a bit of a name for themselves already by this point for bad tie-ins, following the disastrous Superman 64 the year before. But don't worry, we'll get to that doozy. For those of us that grew up in the 80s and 90s, there's little that's more nostalgic than buddy cop movies like Bad Boys, starring Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, and directed by Michael Bay. These movies were big hits, and where there was a hit movie, a tie-in video game was never far behind. Enter Bad Boys Miami Takedown, which came out around the same time as Bad Boys 2. Missions in the game task you with gunning down waves of thugs while collecting evidence or shielding your AI partner, using pistols, shotguns, and grenades. There's a basic cover system where you duck behind walls and lean out to aim and fire, but entering and exiting cover happens at a snail's pace, often glitching so your character clips through objects or stays stuck, leaving you wide open to enemies. The enemy AI is dumb and mindlessly loops the same patrol paths, sometimes jamming behind indestructible barrels, and controls are janky, with hit detection often flaking out. This all disappointed those looking for the same energy and fun as the movies. 2 more Star Wars games round out our long list of movie tie-ins, the first of which was sadly the final video game ever to be published by LucasArts, Star Wars Connect. Like the name suggests, Star Wars Kinect uses the motion sensor capabilities of the Xbox 360 Kinect and has you slicing at foes with your lightsaber in one hand, while vaguely waving around your other hand to mimic using the Force, letting you shove enemies away. You also dodge blaster fire by jumping or ducking in your living room, pilot X-Wings by tilting your body like a cockpit, and even pod race through Tatooine canyons by leaning into sharp turns. If that all sounds like a lot to try to tackle in a single game, even on the admittedly proven and well-received Kinect platform, that's because it most definitely was. LucasArts and developer Terminal Reality get props for ambition, but on execution, most of the functionality was horribly botched. The sensor glitches mid-duel, registering wild flails as either nothing or phantom punches that leave you slashing air while the enemies you thought you'd be able to take out easily pummel you. These inconsistent controls break immersion more frequently than you'd like. Though if I'm being honest, there's not all that much immersion to break, considering the game is little more than a sloppy patchwork of mini-games strung together by a very thin story. A simple remaster of two other games from 20 years earlier. What could be easier than that to earn a quick buck on a reliable IP? Well, apparently it wasn't as easy as you'd think for developer Aspyr, because when the game launched, the online multiplayer, which was supposed to be the very heart of the experience, totally crumbled, with apparently just 3 servers launched for the thousands of players who got the game. This led to a ridiculous quantity of crashes and rubber banding. But performance aside, the port has significant other flaws. The AI is totally broken, the graphical upgrade is low effort, and the game is filled with bugs. And the multiplayer is so unredeemably horrible that servers largely sat idle shortly after release and remain that way today. Worst of all is the price. Both of the original Battlefront games are still available today, and the two of them combined are cheaper than the remake, but without all the bugs and other pitfalls that ruin the fun. This confirms for many that the classic collection is a rip-off cash grab if there ever was one, made even more egregious by the fact that Aspyr was caught using uncredited assets from free mods instead of going through the effort of porting everything over themselves. We've got a little bit of a bonus game here because technically this game is based on Lord of the Rings the book series, not the movies, but since this is the only book-based game on this list, I thought I'd slide it in right here at the tail end of this category. There's not much that really needs to be said about Lord of the Rings Gollum. I mean, just look at it. It's an abomination, and it's made so much worse by the fact that many Lord of the Rings games are fantastic examples of tie-ins gone right. Take The Two Towers back in 2002, for example. This was a great game by all accounts and is remembered fondly to this day as an engaging hack and slash that innovated just enough to keep things interesting and looked great. In fact, honestly, if you ask me, the 3D graphics hold up better than Gollum's, which is pretty astonishing considering the game came out 20 years earlier. Beyond the embarrassing graphics, there's the mission design, which is so boring it's amazing to me that anyone made it through the 15 or so hours of meager gameplay the game had to offer. Lord of the Rings Gollum was so bad that developer and publisher Daedalic publicly apologized and immediately shut down their development studio for good. Following this, details emerged about poor working conditions and insufficient budget, tarnishing Daedalic's reputation forever. They were even accused of using ChatGPT to generate their apology statement. Not a good look. We're moving on from movies as our next category focuses on the world of toy tie-ins. Now to be fair, a lot of bad toy tie-in games primarily target children, so they're rarely going to reach a level of complexity and sophistication to be considered among the top rung of games. But some are just so lazy we've got no choice but to call them out. After all, kids deserve fun games too. 1991's Barbie is a side-scrolling platformer where you control the iconic doll in a bizarre dream world overrun by a poltergeist. Barbie punches or tosses crackers at flying clothes, evil stockings, and flopping fish while collecting hearts to heal, aiming to save her nursery and reunite with Ken through 6 short but tedious levels. The protagonist's oversized sprite hogs the screen, making it impossible to dodge the constant barrage of unseen projectiles. Enemies clip right inside you thanks to her sluggish jumps and her horribly slow walking that makes it feel like the developers, in this case Imagineering again, forgot to code momentum into the movement. You'll probably die a dozen times in the opening room alone, restarting from checkpoints that barely feel like you're making progress. And when you get past it, you'll see the levels blend into repetitive monotony, like endless fountains that spray water jets that you need to time perfectly, and other features that just repeat over and over. Barbie is a frustrating mess even for adults to get through, much less the young girls that make up its target audience. And this wasn't even the worst Barbie game. In 1993, Tahoe Software Productions upped the ante with supposedly educational action game Barbie Supermodel, which casts you once again as Barbie as you jet to fashion shows in glitzy spots around the world like Paris and Hawaii, where you tackle a string of mini-games to prep for the runway. You start by piloting Barbie's pink Corvette through dull, looping streets, swerving past pedestrians in potholes with finicky controls that make every bump feel like a ridiculous hassle. And hit detection is so loose you'll definitely end up losing health points unfairly, forcing many restarts and without extra lives or continues to soften the blow. Then come the dress up and makeup challenges, where you stare at a fleeting photo of an outfit, then tediously match clothes and jewelry from a menu or dab on lipstick and eyeshadow in a timed puzzle that's insultingly basic, even considering the young audience the game's going for, and equally repetitive and just played out. But the real drag is on the catwalk finale, where you have to hit button sequences from memory in a stiff, jerky strut. Barbie's animations during this are so wooden and limited she looks barely alive, turning the whole parade into a plodding embarrassment. 10 years after Barbie comes the next big thing in plastic dolls for little girls. I'm talking about Bratz, with a Z. The fashion doll franchise invented in the early 2000s by a guy called Carter Bryant and owned by the MGA Entertainment Company. Incidentally, the company that in 2018 saved Toys R Us Canada from shutting down, at least temporarily. But it was in 2002 that Bratz entered the video game arena with its self-titled debut game. Bratz puts you in control of one of 4 sassy characters to launch a hip magazine by dancing and solving basic puzzles. You start by slapping together outfits from a handful of available clothes and accessories in a simple menu, and then you jump into rhythm stages, which are not good. The icons never sync with the music's beat, turning supposed dance-offs into a semi-random timing exercise set to tinny, forgettable techno music that's even worse than the background music of an early Epoch video. Yeah, I know. Levels last just minutes, with janky animations making the girls twitch like creepy puppets instead of the smooth grooving they were probably aiming for, and unresponsive inputs that make the harder modes ridiculously hard, forcing restarts that kill any flow the game might have had. But we ain't done with Bratz yet, my friends. Oh no. Honestly, we could spend the next 20 minutes covering all the garbage Bratz games. For instance, there's Bratz Forever Diamonds, with a Z, published by THQ, who never saw a cash grab tie-in game they wouldn't publish. Forever Diamonds puts you and the gals on a cross-country road trip to snag a spot in a big fashion design contest. The trouble starts right away with the driving segments linking cities. They're a mindless grind where you just accelerate continuously and collect these floating blings, with a Z, as they call them, with no turns, crashes, or any real input needed. Some have even compared this mode unfavorably to the infamous Big Rigs, which you might remember from our video on flops of the 2000s. Worse are the mini-games peppering every mission, from gem sorting puzzles to water ski jumps. They sound cute, but repeat endlessly with controls that misfire your stylus swipes and button presses, spiking your frustration and your blood pressure. Okay, I need to clear up some confusion with this one because it's really bothering me, and I know that the history of Bratz video games is something that's important to you as well. So, there was a Bratz movie that came out in 2007. Crucially, this movie featured Jon Voight as character Skylar Shea's godfather.
Just driving around in Jon Voight's car.
Now, there was also a Bratz game that came out in 2007 called Bratz the Movie. I need you to understand that this game had absolutely nothing to do with Bratz the movie. Au contraire, for there is a game tie-in for Bratz the Movie, and that's called Bratz For Real, with a 4 and a Z. That game is also bad, but completely unrelated to Bratz the Movie the game. I'm not even going to say much about this game other than to say it's bad. It's as bad as all the other Bratz games. Let's move on, shall we? In the 90s and 2000s, there were some pretty weird trends in toys, from milk bottle caps you'd flip over with a metal slammer to electronic pet keychains. One of the weirdest was a return to popularity of an ancient toy so old that examples were found in King Tut's tomb. I'm talking about the spinning top, which rose from the ashes with the Beyblade franchise. Several Beyblade video games followed, the worst of which was probably 2002's Beyblade Let It Rip for the PlayStation. In the game, you customize your spinning top with options from a tiny shop with barely 50 options available, and then launch into stadium battles. And that's about it. There's also a free play mode. The menus and dialogue lag horribly, so it takes forever to navigate anything. The translations from the original Japanese are laughably bad, and the so-called bit beasts, which are summoned creatures from the show, are so weak that they're pretty much pointless in battle. Fans of the show might have been pleased to have something, anything, on a home console for their favorite ancient pastime, but for those looking for an actually fun experience, they'd have to either stick to handheld options or wait until better entries like V-Force Super Tournament on the GameCube. Hot Wheels, the world's best driver, puts you behind the wheel of customizable toy cars as one of 4 teams, like the green team for raw speed or red for stunts. There are an admittedly impressive 50+ looping tracks across 4 global facilities. However, gameplay skips head-to-head races to mainly focus on solo challenges, which is an interesting and disappointing decision considering the first thing anyone ever tries to do with Hot Wheels is race them against each other. Making matters worse, the loose and unresponsive controls make it really hard to avoid fishtailing unpredictably, making drifting and landing jumps feel almost luck-based. And the gimmicky events turn boring really fast, leaving you with the impression you'd be better off just playing with real Hot Wheels in your imagination. Surprisingly developed by EA, Littlest Pet Shop is maybe the obvious route for bringing a toy franchise like this one into the video game world. You collect virtual versions of the toy pets and have them participate in mini-games to earn accessories. It's the kind of thing that's been done a million times and far better. The idea of having kids grind boring mini-games to earn money is a cruel lesson in the way of the world that robs them of the joy of childhood. And yet that's exactly what this game is aiming to do because it's definitely not complex or challenging enough for even the lowest IQ adults to play. In between the 9 to 5 earnings grind, all you can really do is brush and feed your pets to up their happiness meter, which doesn't really affect much, leaving them to wander around aimlessly while you watch them. It's rare that LEGO missteps as badly with video games as they did with 2003's Bionicle. In fact, some of the best tie-in games in history have been LEGO parodies. That makes the failure of Bionicle, one of the last ever games made by British developer Argonaut, all the more disappointing. The game is a 3D action platformer where you control one of 6 heroes to battle infected minions across the world of Matanui. You'd think the fact that there are 6 heroes to pick from and that you're able to constantly switch between them, and between the various environments of the game, that would be a positive thing. But in reality, the false sense of variety just seems like it's there to mask the extremely basic platforming that makes up the core gameplay throughout. The camera angles are unwieldy, as is so often the case for low-quality 3D games of this era. The few boss fights in the game are too easy and quick once you learn the obvious patterns, and the controls are unresponsive and confusing for kids, who are presumably the target audience considering the complete lack of scope and very short length of the game, clocking in at just around 2 hours. By this point, if you've forgotten the categories I mentioned in the intro, you've probably noticed a glaring gap in our game list. Pay better attention to the intro next time. I spent a lot of time writing this stuff. Anyway, we haven't gone into any of the horror show entries based on superheroes. Well, fear not, because there are just so many bad ripoff games based on the legends from the comics that we've decided to feature an entire section dedicated entirely to them. The final game ever made by Argonaut Games was the EA-published Catwoman, based on the box office bomb of the same name. A terrible movie with one saving grace. Ahem. Anyway, it was obvious this movie was going to get a video game tie-in, and it fell to the struggling developer Argonaut to make it. In the game, you carry out acrobatic leaps that often feel like a fight against the controls themselves, because for some reason the decision was made for the analog stick to handle both movement and attacks. So a simple wall run can accidentally trigger a punch, sending you tumbling off ledges mid-jump. While you're struggling with the controls, the camera will be swinging wildly for dramatic angles during fights, but this hides enemies from your view at inopportune moments. Then, in tight corridors, the camera will zoom in too close, turning puzzle solving into confusing guesswork. And as is the norm with cheap tie-ins, the game is way too short, at around just 5 hours long, meaning it's over quick, but maybe not quick enough. You know you're in for a real treat when a game opens up with Superman having a conversation with the Statue of Liberty drawn in a chibi anime style. The strange art style, while often criticized, is actually, I gotta admit, one of the better aspects of this game, getting around the inability to show faces on the low resolution of the NES. The game largely reused its music from another Kemco game, Indora no Hikari, which, while not terrible for an NES soundtrack, isn't particularly fitting for a Superman game. Now, I couldn't find any information on if it's an American mistranslation, but Superman in this game straight up kills some of the goons throughout the game as they plead for mercy, something I don't exactly remember from most iterations of the usually upstanding character. The controls of the game are widely considered to be stilted and awkward, with many common early platformer mistakes like up as jump and A as an attack and action button. While there clearly was at least some effort put into this game, it was dragged down by many factors. The controls and cryptic NES progression and difficulty made it hard to get through, and many elements of the game are just plain weird, like needing to use a subway system to get around. Also, Superman's superpowers needing to be collected like traditional NES game weapons, and nonsensical quests with generic villains. All of it left a bad taste in people's mouths, cementing Superman's status as a bad tie-in game. One of only 2 games based on the second animated He-Man series, Masters of the Universe has you guide He-Man through 13 linear dungeon levels in an isometric view, slashing skeletons and beastly minions and hunting down glowing portals to destroy them and stop the endlessly spawning enemies spewing forth from them. Then, of course, you fight a boss by learning its attack patterns and exploiting weak spots. But combat drags into tedium because even weak enemies absorb hit after hit before falling, forcing you to repeat the same block counter rhythm until your arms ache. Bosses can stretch into a ridiculous 20 or 30 minutes this way, so you'll be both physically and mentally exhausted before the end. The portals you're looking for are often hiding in corners, so you're stuck farming respawns just to progress, with no real variety to keep it fresh. And jumping between platforms worsens the problem since the tilted camera can mislead you on distances, costing lives unfairly and forcing you to restart a section over and over. 2011's X-Men Destiny was developed by a studio that'll no doubt be familiar to fans of the channel, the controversial Canadian outfit helmed by Dennis Dyack, Silicon Knights. In fact, this would prove to be the final game ever made by Silicon Knights, as costs piled up from lawsuits and several unsuccessful games, and funding from the government dried up. In X-Men Destiny, you pick one of 3 new mutants, a Japanese activist's daughter, a Puritan-raised teen, or a college jock, who awaken their powers during a mutant rally gone wrong in San Francisco. From there, interestingly, you'll join your choice of either the X-Men or Brotherhood of Mutants, though big choices like this hardly end up mattering in the end. But the combat ultimately devolves into mashing buttons in fenced-off areas against waves of identical foes, with fights dragging on because attacks barely stagger groups of enemies, forcing endless swings that feel pointless after the first hour or so. Even bosses like Juggernaut follow the same pattern, interrupted by AI teammates who either steal your kills or flop around uselessly. Sticking with X-Men, 1989's The Uncanny X-Men suffers from incredibly ugly graphics and poor gameplay. It features a jarringly inconsistent top-down perspective where objects are given a slight directional slant, but the stage remains flat. Points for trying to make an illusion of perspective, I guess, but the end result is so inconsistent that it borders on eye strain at times. Critics criticize the character sprites for looking next to nothing like their comic counterparts. While the actual game's storyline is almost non-existent, it does have something of a mysterious story to its real-world existence. It's an LJN game with all the standard substandardness that comes with, but its actual development was contracted out to a ghost developer, the only LJN game where this is the case. To this day, no one really knows which studio really made the Uncanny X-Men, as they were completely uncredited. It was also the last LJN game released before they were sold to Acclaim. As a hybrid beat-em-up and adventure game, it does feature 2-player co-op, though it also features a buggy AI for the partner character when not controlled by a second player. The game's adventure elements harm it more than helping it, forcing tedious exploration through levels that look as bad as they play. The game also doesn't feature a traditional HUD, forcing the player to check the inventory screen to see health and score. As a final insult, the game's ultimate level is nearly inaccessible without external guides, as the code that would normally show you the series of inputs needed to access it was cut from the game before its final release. In 2024, developer Rocksteady, who is renowned for their Batman Arkham series of games, created one of the most mediocre games in recent memory. The consensus among reviewers is that the gameplay of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is dull and repetitive, even with the use of multiple characters with different traversal techniques. The servers for its online features also suffered heavily around launch, and it was criticized for poor bug testing overall. The majority of the ire that Suicide Squad drew, however, was pointed towards its creative failings. As Suicide Squad was intended to take place in the Arkham continuity, its handling of Batman was met with almost universal fan backlash, with the character unceremoniously killed off, especially problematic for fans considering it was one of the final posthumous performances from fan-favorite actor Kevin Conroy. The game ultimately failed to perform up to publisher expectations, with Warner Bros. Too embarrassed to give full sales figures, though a confirmed failure to break even by about $200 million cements its status as a complete flop of a tie-in. Batman: Dark Tomorrow is truly frustrating, allegedly inspiring madness in those who have played it. It's an action stealth game, like the later Arkham series, or at least it was trying to be, but it was widely criticized on release for its terrible controls, terrible camera, and repetitive missions. Game Informer criticized it heavily for being incomprehensible and littered with bugs, giving the game an unheard of 0.75 out of 10 rating, among their worst ever ratings published. The game is infamous for cryptic conditions to reach the good ending, involving an unmarked objective to lockpick a WMD before fighting the final boss, with any save made after this point locking the player into the bad ending. A terrible and cynical attempt at forcing a replay that instead results most frequently in a rage quit. That's right, another X-Men game. It seems like the property was doomed to attract quite a few poor adaptations, and Mojo World is yet another good, or bad, example. This one is a really bland platformer, plagued by poor combat and frankly some of the most uninspired levels and enemies ever committed to cartridge. The platforming physics are generally poor, and enemies take a large number of hits to take out, despite their relative harmlessness otherwise. The game is also incredibly short, with small levels and ridiculously simplistic bosses. Graphically, it's not terrible, but it's far from the prettiest game of 1996. It's mostly notable for being quite a late Game Gear game, only produced around a year before the system was discontinued, and that's about all it's remembered for. A tie-in to the movie of the same name, Batman Beyond: The Return of Joker is yet another dull beat-em-up aiming to cash in on the brand's success. This game is ugly. Its lazy attempts to capture the stylization of the source material fall flat, leading to the characters looking lanky while moving incredibly awkwardly. The enemy variety is extremely lacking, and the enemy AI is pathetically weak, hardly ever managing to land a hit against basic spammed kicks. Even if an enemy does land a hit, the damage dealt is so pathetic that it borders on trivial. This leads to the game being among the most sluggish ever created, as it's little more than a scripted endurance test to see how many useless targets you can take down before you turn the console off out of boredom. This game was incredibly short as well, despite being a slog. Reviewers reported being done with it in about 1 to 2 hours, hardly longer yet infinitely more boring than the film it was based on. Watchmen: The End Is Nigh is an episodic beat-em-up released as a prequel to the film. Part 1 received rather mixed reviews, with most reviewers rightfully calling out how shallow the gameplay was. Its combat was seen as clunky. Part 2, though, received universally worse reception, with almost identical gameplay to the first part, while its story was seen as redundant by many. There isn't much to be said about this game, other than it's still on Steam for a decently cheap price, which is somewhat uncommon for tie-ins from the 2000s, especially bad ones, where license agreements were particularly harsh on digital storefronts, making a lot of them, sometimes mercifully, difficult to get your hands on nowadays. So you can still enjoy, that's probably not the right word, you can still experience the mediocrity that is Watchmen: The End Is Nigh, at least until it too disintegrates and is lost for good. Based on the then-current animated series, this game is an LJN game at heart. But on top of the common bland color palette, bad combat, and poor level design, 1995 Spider-Man finds a new and unique way to be completely terrible. Its ear-splitting soundtrack. From the second the game boots up, it sounds like the Genesis sound chip is being tormented to its very limits. Almost every song in this game finds a unique way to degrade your eardrums. This culminates in the Funhouse levels theme, which is cartoonishly terrible. Here, take a listen. The game garnered mostly mediocre contemporary reviews and has sunken into obscurity since then, where it belongs. Spider-Man: Edge of Time is an all-around mediocre title as well. The game's story and voice acting were generally praised, but the majority of criticism states that it simply didn't live up to previous Spider-Man titles, feeling like a definite step back from Shattered Dimensions, from which it inherited many of its systems. It was also criticized for its repetitive gameplay while feeling less polished than it should have been. It's perhaps a credit to Spider-Man tie-ins in general that apart from this game, and the Genesis one with the ear-destroying music, the franchise has mostly escaped the dangers of bad tie-in exploitation. Superman, Man of Steel was actually praised for its graphics and sound design when it came out, but its gameplay couldn't match these aspects in quality. The game used the classic arcadey weapon icon system, a terrible match for any game about a superhero with natural superpowers. As a result, the game feels much more generic than it would if Superman had full access to all of his powers. Now reportedly, the pre-release copies of the game sent to reviewers featured a softlock bug involving this power system, where collecting the wrong icon would make progression impossible, and this tanked, maybe unfairly, the already mediocre review scores, with frustrated reviewers having to restart the game with a reset button. More recent player retrospectives have been a lot kinder to the game, with the limitations of its arcade-styled nature being much less off-putting than it was to reviewers of the time. The soundtrack in particular has seen significant praise. Aiming for a strange 2.5D style, this beat-em-up didn't land well with reviewers or gamers at all. Models move in strange stilted ways, which combined with the mixture of pre-rendered and polygonal graphics gives this game a very unique ugliness. The combat is quite monotonous as well, and aside from the 2.5D background fights, uninspired. The funk jazz soundtrack, while not ear-bleedingly bad, is definitely unfitting for the game. The game's worst crime really though, is it's just incredibly boring, a fate that's sometimes even worse than being memorably horrible. 2008's Iron Man was a highly anticipated AAA release that wound up simply disappointing. The combat is clunky and repetitive, with a common point of criticism being the controls. Many mission objectives throughout the game were relegated to fighting certain amounts of enemies and other monotonous tasks. And the campaign, even with that padding, is also rather short, especially for a AAA game. The graphics are certainly not the greatest either, even by 2008 standards. Ultimately, people expected better, especially from a AAA release attached to a big brand like Iron Man was in 2008. Thor: God of Thunder has to be one of the worst hack-and-slash games ever made. Its gameplay and graphics are genuinely terrible, and its frame rates are some of the worst ever to exist on a console. Its levels are incredibly repetitive, a perfect match for some of the clunkiest combat ever seen. This game is truly deserving of the terrible review scores that have plagued it ever since its release. This game is not to be confused with WayForward's Nintendo handheld game of the same name, which, while still not great, is significantly better than what was put forward on mainstream consoles. Justice League Task Force is a fairly usual fighting game, though a particularly dull one. Most reviews gave it middling scores, calling it below average for a fighting game with no real unique features to distinguish it from others in the genre beyond its prestigious license. One interesting quirk of history is that the Super Nintendo version of the game was developed by Blizzard and ported to the Genesis by Condor, which later became Blizzard North. Being released in 1995, it's possible that Justice League Task Force was getting significantly less attention than Blizzard's Warcraft: Orcs and Humans, a far more influential and well-received game releasing in November of that same year, which would go on, of course, to launch a multi-billion-dollar franchise. Aquaman: Battle for Atlantis puts you in control of the underwater hero swimming through foggy, ruined streets of his sinking kingdom. You follow radar signals to scattered fights against small groups of foes where you use simple punches, kicks, trident throws, and occasional telepathic calls for shark allies. Most of the 21 levels boil down to this. Drift along to the next blip, mash attacks on the same 3 enemy types with identical movesets, then move on, all while static comic panels advance a bare-bones plot. The repetition grinds you down fast, as levels rarely change beyond swapping water for lava pools or adding a crumbling wall to circle, leaving vast empty spaces that feel aimless and drawn out despite the game's short 4-hour run. Okay, last X-Men game, I promise. This is a weird one because not all versions of X-Men Origins Wolverine suck. There was a special Uncaged edition that came out for non-Nintendo next-gen consoles, which netted itself a mature 17+ ESRB rating, but provided players a much better and more authentic Wolverine experience, with the full use of his abilities and the graphic violence that went along with them. But the other version, receiving an E for Everyone 10+ rating and releasing on the Wii, DS, and weaker PlayStation systems, instead had stripped-back graphics and reduced resolution that significantly impaired gameplay and accentuated the significant flaws of the game, including repetitive combat and mundane puzzle design. This beat 'em up goes for the same photo-scanned art style as games like Mortal Kombat, but here it only harms the realism rather than helping it like the intention clearly was. Worse yet, the so-called realism of the graphics is obviously just there to mask serious flaws in other aspects of the game. Batman Forever suffers from poor combat, as is often the case for games that go for this style and aren't Mortal Kombat, against enemies with very little variety, likely owing to the expense of the photo scanning process and subsequent high cost of having too many different sprites. Most outlets gave the game below average review scores, citing the sluggish combat, bad sound design, and clashing art style of the backgrounds and the digitized characters. In The Incredible Hulk, you control Marvel's Green Giant as you rampage through a quarantined New York City, smashing cars, toppling skyscrapers, and battling Abomination's forces in an open-world setup. Missions often boil down to chasing convoys, pounding waves of identical soldiers, or piling up debris to hit arbitrary quotas. Tasks that repeat with little variation, turning the game into a bit of a tedious grind to get through where thrills are few and far between. Collecting the 200 glowing power nodes you're supposed to winds up feeling like busy work as you're forced to go back through the same empty streets repeatedly, dodging lazy enemy patterns that barely challenge you. These fetch-style objectives lack any decent amount of creativity, and since the game also skimps on polish and story, the boring gameplay is really all there is to it. Playing as the titular Swamp Thing, a somewhat lesser-known figure from DC Comics, you fight a Mad Doctor's legion of mechanical minions, including imitation swamp creatures that bear an uncanny resemblance to enemies from Sonic the Hedgehog released the year prior. Enemy designs aren't the only thing lifted from elsewhere, however, as the underlying game engine and mechanics are largely the same as Imagineering's other games, namely Bart vs. the Space Mutants, with the same engine being used for Bart Meets Radioactive Man and Home Alone 2. Criticism of this game is largely leveled at just how mundane it is. The swampy levels don't feel particularly different from many of the other bland yet frustrating licensed NES games of the time. Its soundtrack isn't by any stretch of the imagination great, it's simply dull, just like the game itself, which by the way is simultaneously just too difficult to enjoy. We all knew this was coming. The rings, the ungodly green fog, everything in Superman the New Superman Adventures, better known as Superman 64, is an unbearable slog, and it hardly needs an introduction. The game begins with Lex Luthor taking hostages into a simulated world, forcing Superman to follow him. The simple and yet silly premise is far from the most baffling thing about this game, however, as everything from the game's controls, inconsistent frame rates, and its unpolished physics engine is your enemy. The game features many levels that force Superman to fly through a guided path of rings in order, with no enemies in sight, while battling the aforementioned fundamental aspects of the game instead. The lesser-known levels outside of the ring stages are just as bad, if not worse, though. The game's downright terrible design is blamed by developers on Warner Bros. Licensing team, who constantly shot down Titus Interactive's ideas of really any action Superman could take, unless comic documentation was cited, with the virtual world setting also stemming from Warner vetoing any violence against people in the quote real world. The dreaded ring stages, which were originally envisioned as a flight control tutorial, became filler for the voids left in the game due to cuts that had to be made. Because of the wildly fluctuating scope of the game and the red tape surrounding every idea they had for the game, almost none of its 2-year development cycle was used for bug testing and quality assurance, which meant the final product was of low quality and infamously bug-riddled. The rest, of course, is history, as the game scored a universal scorn from critics and gamers alike, which deservedly made it a common punching bag in the early days of internet reviews. Next up, we're hitting the small screen with bad tie-in games based on the reliable old TV show. I have to be honest and say that some of these games I didn't even know existed, but I guess nothing surprises me when greedy TV networks are involved. The Office is one of the most successful sitcoms of all time, and NBC has cashed in on a number of promotions outside TV, including a trivia board game, a DVD board game, a Clue board game, a Monopoly board game. Holy cow, they made a lot of Office board games. T-shirts, bobbleheads, even Dunder Mifflin branded copy paper, and a surprisingly meta bit of merch. In 2007, it was the Office PC game where you play as Jim Halpert during a branch merger and compete in sales efficiency contests against rivals like Dwight and Andy. It's a point-and-click casual game, basically a clone of Diner Dash slapped with Office characters as bobbleheads. There are 30 levels or so, but they're all the same, clicking around on memos and coffee cups and bringing them to co-workers' desks, with no real strategy or escalation beyond slightly more cluttered desks. It's almost as if they thought what people really liked about the show was the actual drudgery of being in an office and performing tasks. Star Trek Infinite is a 4X grand strategy game where you lead a Star Trek faction like the Federation or the Klingon Empire across a procedurally generated galaxy. Gameplay revolves around exploring star systems, expanding outposts, exploiting resources for shipbuilding, and exterminating rivals through diplomacy or combat. Kinda like Paradox's other game, Stellaris, but so much worse. And that's essentially exactly what it is. The game mechanics are so similar to a stripped-down version of Stellaris that it feels like you're playing a mod of that game. And the worst part is, there is a Star Trek mod of that game, and it's free. Now, the thing about Paradox is, and this has gotten more true over time, is that they have a business model where they deliver a game right out of the gate that's okay, but it gets better and better over time as functionality is added in via DLCs. Now, I'm not going to opine on whether I think that's good or bad, but what occasionally happens is a game's initial sales are lower than the company wanted, and it's essentially abandoned in its initial launch state. That leaves early buyers totally in the lurch, as they paid full price for what amounts to an unfinished game, and when there's an IP like Star Trek involved, you can't help but feel like it was a lazy cash grab from the start. There was only ever one game made for home consoles based on the TV show Alf, and that was the one for the Master System that came out in 1989. You go around as the furry alien as you sneak through the Tanner family home and backyard, collecting random items like a key, ladder, bathing suit, and other stuff, to repair your ship and escape Earth. It's a cheap 20-minute adventure that provides a lot of value in a way, since that 20 minutes will feel like hours. Alf moves way too slow and unresponsively, and hit detection on enemies is so bad you're flailing at bats endlessly, even though you feel like you hit them, and they live and they get through to kill you instantly, forcing you to restart. And when I say instantly, I mean it. Alf absorbs no damage and dies way too easily. Besides the enemies, there are also instant death traps like randomized closet doors that zap you to death, a classic element of lazy game design. The many frustrating and unfair deaths you'll encounter might make the game feel longer than it actually is, but you'll hate every second of it. Pimp My Ride drops you into the role of a mechanic in a flat, empty version of Pimp City, where you're tasked by Exhibit with scraping together cash for car makeovers. You start by cruising bland streets in your starter ride, earning money through repetitive side tasks like inching along at low speeds to mash buttons for hollering at crowds, or lightly bumping pedestrians to drop pickups, all while a timer ticks down on your way to grab a client's beat-up vehicle. Geez, I didn't realize that MTV was this cheap that they'd make people go out from the production team and start earning money to fund the show. Next up is the customization mode, where you're given just 90 seconds to pick your rims, paint, and stereos, but since the most expensive stuff always wins, the only real strategy you need to have is spend the maximum amount of money possible. When you deliver the car, there's a drag race for some reason, where the upgrades you've put in barely do anything, and the frame rate is so bad it'll make you sick to your stomach. All this means that when the game bugs out and crashes for the second or third time, you probably won't even bother turning it back on again. What starts off as a folksy, if a little dull, errand-running game for fans of the Duck Dynasty TV show quickly sours from the sheer repetitiveness and emptiness of the world. Quests recycle the same tasks over and over. The so-called open world that they market the game with is sprawling but completely barren, a common pitfall for many games marketed as open world, forcing endless, uneventful treks across foggy swamps with no wildlife to spot or paths to stray on. So while the game spans probably around 8 hours, a lot of that is spent doing almost literally nothing. A lot of the standard complaints are also present here. The AI is poor, the minigames are uninspired, and there are so many bugs and glitches and crashes and performance dips. This last point, performance dips, is especially confusing since the graphics are so dated you'd think the game would at least run smoothly. I'm not certain who wanted to play a game based on Duck Dynasty, but whoever they are, they deserve better. In the Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends for the NES, you alternate between Bullwinkle the Moose and Rocky the Flying Squirrel to side-scroll through 5 forgettable stages chasing keys and Bullwinkle's inheritance while dodging enemies. Bullwinkle charges headfirst into enemies, which chips away at his health, while Rocky glides short distances to cross paths. The ability to switch between the two is actually a pretty good twist. Something akin to Donkey Kong Country, only with none of the things that make that game good, like smooth gameplay, engaging visuals, good music, interesting level design, the list goes on and on. Instead, you get a frustrating platformer where both characters handle really badly, sliding forward uncontrollably or falling to their deaths attempting near impossible jumps. Meanwhile, enemies are piling up everywhere. It's less a game and more a tedious endurance test. It's Howie Mandel, and he's letting you pick from 26 randomized briefcases hiding cash prizes ranging from 1 cent to $1 million. Sounds pretty exciting, especially if this is real life and you've got a chance at a life-changing sum of cash. Unfortunately, the concept does not translate well to a video game, or even a TV show for that matter, and is excruciatingly dull. Every session uses the same still animations, the same Howie voice clips, and the same completely luck-based gameplay. There's zero real competition or strategy to the game, which in the end boils down to a random number generator with a coat of paint. Really, really ugly paint. It's Noel Edmonds, and he's letting you pick from 26 randomized briefcases hiding cash prizes ranging from 1 pence to £250,000. Yeah, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, Deal or No Deal returns with The Banker is Back, which is based on the UK version of the show. So this one doesn't even feature our beloved Howie. The game suffers from all the same problems as the first Deal or No Deal, but with full playthroughs flying by even faster, which might be a good thing I'd guess come to think of it. The issue is though that the quicker game pace means there's no time for tension to build, making the stakes feel even lower, leaving you to just click boxes at random as fast as you can to just get the thing over with, like a very plain slot machine. In fact, the game has less complexity than you would have seen in a minigame of a platformer of the 80s like those in Super Mario Bros. 3. I suppose the one thing games like Deal or No Deal have going for them is the extreme level of accessibility to non-gamers, but I have to imagine the thrill of artificial success even wears off pretty quick for them. Avatar: The Last Airbender: Quest for Balance. Wow, talk about a long title. Is a co-op action-adventure game where you switch between Aang and 8 friends from the show as you relive the series' story across 18 short chapters. Fans of the series, despite perhaps finding brief moments of nostalgia-based joy, are nearly unanimous in their disappointment with this game. It's painfully obvious that almost no budget went into this short 5-hour or so game, with main complaints centered around the combat system, which feels slow and unintuitive. The gameplay is repetitive and boring, with no interesting mechanics to break up the simplicity that feels like it's out of an earlier era of gaming. The graphics too feel like they come from an earlier time, and not in a good or charming way. There's no detail, and the characters look super blocky and undefined, giving the whole thing a low-effort vibe. There are some puzzle elements as well, but these are also repetitive and lazily implemented, dragging on as mere busy work. Even the story, which should have been the one saving grace, feels rushed, with key moments from the series glossed over or sometimes even missing completely. Most people don't think of The Simpsons when bad tie-ins are mentioned, because somewhat surprisingly, Fox has avoided to a large extent the shamelessness that leads to the calamities that litter this list. But there are a few exceptions, the most obvious being 2001's PlayStation exclusive The Simpsons Wrestling. The game boils down to endless button presses with just a handful of moves per character, offering no real combos or counters to mix things up. It feels half-finished, as if there was a plan to add in more variety to fights, but they just never got around to it. The feeling is made stronger by the absolutely eye-destroying graphics. You have to give it some slack in this department because it's only a PlayStation 1 game, I get it, but it's really hard to see the year this came out, 2001, and imagine how anyone thought The Simpsons Wrestling looks even close to good enough. Even the characters themselves get grating after a while, with opponents' silly banter blurted out on repeat as they stand around waiting to be pummeled. Based on the UK game show of the same name, in 2008 Mindscape released the Europe-exclusive Golden Balls for the Wii and the Nintendo DS. Golden Balls. Yep. The game takes place in a studio with up to 3 AI opponents or a friend, where you compete for a cash jackpot by grabbing golden balls from a machine. Like Deal or No Deal, there's a huge element of luck at play here, and any strategic elements are usually just a charade, like in the final round where you're faced with the choice to split or steal, but the AI players never split, always stealing your winnings in a predictable betrayal that kills any thrill of bluffing or trust building like you see in the TV show. We return one more time to the Simpsons universe with 1995's The Itchy and Scratchy game, where you play as Itchy the Mouse on a non-stop rampage against Scratchy the Cat through 7 themed levels, from a prehistoric jungle to a pirate ship. Bosses at the end of each stage are just oversized Scratchies, and each time you simply evade their swipes, snag power-ups, and spam attacks till they eventually drop. The gameplay is laughably simplistic, with many complaining about the lack of any kind of variety to break up the repetitiveness other than the lack of accuracy of your weapons, which leads to more frustration than real challenge. And the sound quality is poor, especially on the Game Gear version, with Scratchy's agonized yow on every hit getting old real fast. The worst part of Itchy and Scratchy is the comic violence and fast-paced fun of the Simpsons show segments are totally absent, leading to a letdown even for fans of the duo on the show. Just like the show it's based on, Deadliest Catch: Sea of Chaos puts you in the role of a crab boat captain navigating Alaska's Bering Sea, trying to earn a living in one of the most dangerous careers out there. The heart of the gameplay comes down to 4 repeating minigames: steering your boat through floating rings to drop baited pots, hooking buoys to haul them up, sorting live crabs by size on a rocking deck, and tossing keepers into bins for sale. The campaign span missions like racing for the biggest haul or reliving events from the TV seasons over 6 in-game stretches, but the cycle drags on for hours, turning urgent crab runs into a monotonous grind where every pot feels like surely this must be the last. None of the show's raw tension is present in the game, like the sinking boats, crew rivalries, or life or death decisions. And sure, all of that's probably scripted anyway, but maybe that's the point, because without that drama, the game feels flat. Homie D Clown is a weird little game based on the character of the same name from the show In Living Color. Once given the dubious honor of being named Computer Gaming World's 5th worst computer game of all time, Homie D Clown has you take on the role of the titular grumpy performer and wander New York's oversized street map trying to land a TV gig. The point-and-click controls were a fairly common genre on the PC of the time, of course, and in games like this, what really matters are the humor elements, story, and immersive world, none of which are exemplified by Homie D Clown. Instead, you're frequently backtracking across the map, trudging along the same routes over and over, turning the short story into hours of aimless, boring wandering. The tinny beeps of the soundtrack and flat voice lines amplify the boredom of the whole thing, which, once you know the right path, is more shallow than even it seems at first, taking maybe 10 minutes to beat. The Sopranos, being one of the greatest TV shows of all time, you can see the potential for a really high quality and groundbreaking video game based on the series. But honestly, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of overlap between Sopranos fans and gamers, given the audience of the show skewed pretty old and the player base of video games, at least back in 2006, was considerably younger. All that said, I think even people that have never seen the show could find a lot of joy in a Grand Theft Auto style open world crime game that follows the events of the 6 seasons. Instead, what we got was a limited, linear adventure game based on just the time between the 5th and 6th seasons of the show, centered on a minor character nobody really cares about. The combat system, based on basic brawling patterns, is super boring. Each fight starts as a quick scrap and stretches into drawn-out slogs as enemies respawn in predictable patterns, draining the thrill from every beatdown and leaving you numb to the routine violence. There's almost no exploration or freedom as you limp along from fight to fight on rigid paths, only lame fetch quests there to break up the repetitive combat. Some of the cast from the show voice the characters, and this is actually surprisingly good, a fact that only makes you even more disappointed with how boring the game is. Want to play a game based on a 1980s British soap opera? Me neither, but apparently Maxen Software thought there was an audience for it on the ZX Spectrum in 1987. In EastEnders, you play as a do-gooder roaming the blocky streets of Albert Square, chatting with pixelated locals from the show like Den or Angie, whoever they are, and then you dive into minigames to help them out. The minigames are just chores, like pouring drinks or cutting roses, and they feel like chores too while you're playing them. With no real fail states to the game to spice things up, the tasks you're doing don't have any kind of tension or payoff to them. The bad graphics smear what should be familiar faces into vague blobs that are barely recognizable from the show, killing the only real thing tying the EastEnders game to its source material, since the rest of the game is completely unrelated. Either that or the show is more boring than I thought. Spoiler alert, this is the only Transformers game that makes it onto our list of the worst tie-in games of all time. I know, a lot of people don't like some of the others that might have made it on, like Transformers the Game in 2007 or Dark of the Moon a few years later, but you know what? I like those games, and this is my list. Fight me. Without a doubt though, and as much as it pains me to say, Beast Wars Transformers is a terrible game. The mechanic where your energon meter depletes the longer you stay in robot mode, forcing you to transform into the useless beast mode constantly, makes for a pointless and boring waiting game where you just run around in your vulnerable state until you can actually start shooting again. And the missions, which often sound deceptively simple like destroy a turret or snag an artifact, end up disorienting due to the vague mission briefings. So you end up wasting hours of your precious life on trial and error navigation, scrambling around aimlessly, praying your energon doesn't run out yet again. Mobile Suit Gundam Battle Operation 2 is a free-to-play online shooter where teams of 3 to 6 players pilot giant mechs called mobile suits in battles lasting about 10 minutes each. By most accounts, the game isn't even necessarily the worst ever, apart from very valid complaints about the monetization. Although, come on, you're playing a free-to-play game after all. And some performance and optimization issues. But the real problem is the peer-to-peer connections that flake out constantly, dropping you offline mid-fight and handing your team a numbers disadvantage. Then when you disconnect, which happens way too frequently and is beyond your control, you're punished with an hour-long ban for deserting, which escalates to weeks or even permanent if you're unlucky enough. Because of these issues, the game lost over 80% of its player base in just the first 2 or 3 months, leading to long waits for matchmaking that persists to this day. American Idol, published by Codemasters, puts you in the shoes of a contestant vying for stardom on the hit TV show. Sounds good, right? You're probably imagining the singing role in Rock Band, but with Simon Cowell telling you how much you suck at the end. That actually doesn't sound too bad. But in a crazy twist, this game, which is ostensibly about a singing competition, features no actual singing. Instead, it's just a standard button-pressing rhythm game. Talk about a low-effort letdown. And the worst thing is, it's not even good for a rhythm game. Songs drag on without build-up, and later rounds just speed up the same patterns, meaning there's no real skill needed beyond tedious muscle memory. And to top it all off, the muffled MIDI covers sound horrible. There are far better rhythm games from this period, like Harmonix's Frequency, an underrated title that's another game we covered in our video on flops of the 2000s. Sure, you don't get Simon bitching at you over and over, but is that really a bad thing? Ben 10 is a straightforward beat-em-up where you control Ben Tennyson on a road trip interrupted by villains from the show. You punch through linear levels full of enemy waves, and you can switch forms if you want, but since most of the specials charge too slowly, and they don't even do that much against the largely identical reused foes you're up against, most of the time you won't even bother. The worst part for fans of the show though is the short length, coming in at a pitiful 2 hours or so, barely enough to scratch the surface before it ends abruptly, leaving you with a hollow sense that you just wasted your time and your money. Unsuitable for any but the very youngest gamers who are hardcore fans of the show, Ben 10 doesn't have a lot going for it. A PS2 exclusive based on the Cartoon Network late-night show Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Zombie Ninja Pro-Am is a tough nut to crack because it seems like it's trying to be bad on purpose. How do you rightly review a game which is deliberately bad? Like you're supposed to be in on some kind of sick joke. The problem is just because something's bad on purpose doesn't make it any less of a slog to get through. The gameplay drags awfully thanks to the painfully slow character speeds, broken up only by enemy ambushes that spam cheap projectiles that you can't easily dodge, which lead to one-hit deaths and endless reloads, which make the trudgery feel even slower. There's some racing segments as well, but these are even worse, with wonky physics that flip your cart on straightaways and rubber band AI that warps ahead no matter how well you thought you were doing. I guess it's all supposed to be so bad it's funny, and at times you have to admit it is kind of funny, but not funny enough to make you want to play any more than you have to. The second game on this list to be published by the aptly named Game Mill Entertainment, the other being Skull Island: The Rise of Kong, The Walking Dead Destinies lets you step into the TV show's first 4 seasons as Rick Grimes, or what's supposed to be Rick Grimes, but who instead looks like an unrecognizable weirdo that gives off a bit of a creepy vibe if I'm being honest. The game in general looks as bad as Rick's face, and it's pretty obvious corners were cut here, since major characters from the show and pivotal moments have been completely skipped or botched. And the gameplay is dull and relies on the same basic patterns on repeat, lining up enemies one after another across identical skirmishes until one infected foe gets in a cheap shot and you die. A lot of the problems might have been fixed in some post-release updates, but the developers of Walking Dead Destinies instead seem to have just taken the money, such as it is, and run. Branded an insult to Doctor Who fans by none other than the usually forgiving official Nintendo magazine, Doctor Who Return to Earth for the Wii lets you switch between the 11th Doctor and Amy Pond from the show, tackling puzzles like scanning glowing orbs with the sonic screwdriver or firing a gravity gun to shift objects and enemies. Most of these puzzles are little more than hunting identical colored panels scattered across empty corridors, zapping them in sequence while the camera swings wildly, blocking your view and sending you tumbling off ledges annoyingly. And there's plenty of poor level design decisions that'll send you backtracking through the drab, low-resolution halls as they struggle to load on the screen, textures often popping in later than they should. The motion controls register inconsistently, and even the story, which is voiced by Matt Smith and Karen Gillan from the show, crumbles under lazy scripting and contrived plot twists. Our final entry from THQ on this list, South Park Snow Day, came out fairly recently in 2024 and was immediately met with disappointment and scorn from longtime fans. One of the biggest issues people had was the toothless nature of the comedy. For those who enjoy the franchise's long history of ruthless and often vulgar mockery, the humor in Snow Day, to the extent that there even is any, is way too benign. The gameplay itself is also a poor experience, the co-op action brawler bogged down by battles that lack any sort of punch, feeling more like repetitive errands than epic fights. The game is extremely short, at around 4 hours, and there isn't much you can even explore despite the shift to a 3D universe. It's such a shame how far the franchise has fallen since the unanimously acclaimed Stick of Truth, which came out 10 years before Snow Day, leaving fans hoping for a return to form in the future. This is it. We've reached the 100th bad tie-in game on our list, and we may just have saved the best, by which I mean the worst, for last. Because Little Britain, the video game, was so roundly and universally panned on release that it ended up the second lowest rated game of all time on the game rankings site, a position it maintained until that site shut down in 2019, surpassed only by the infamous Big Rigs over-the-road racing. Writing for PAL Gaming Network, Neville Nicholson said it was possibly the worst licensed game in the history of mankind. The English language is insufficient to fully describe the atrocities this game comprises. The mini-games that make up the core gameplay are some of the worst ever made, and characters are annoying, the content is scant, and the graphics are nauseating. A total and utter cash grab tie-in scam if there ever was one. What a perfect way to end off. As James Lyon put it in his review in Eurogamer, absolutely appalling. The game's badly animated, graphically poor, and should shame all who made it and all who buy it. Pray for an end to cash-in greed and weep for the death of quality. Did we miss any bad tie-in games you think should have made our list? Let us know in the comments. Maybe we'll even get enough to do a shameless cash grab sequel to this video. A special thank you goes out to our channel's members, who I'm certain have grabbed more than their fair share of golden balls in their day. And if you've enjoyed this video and want to see more like this, I'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means a lot.